Howdy, Immortalium here, and today I'm going to be reviewing Unico by Osamu Tezuka, which is the last of the manga done in the Kids Kickstarter that Digital Manga did a good while back that I've yet to review. I've already reviewed Triton, I've already reviewed Atom Cat, so I've just been left to review Unico. And what are my thoughts on it? Do I think it's suitable for children, etc, etc? Let's get into the review. So let's start off with what is Unico about? Unico opens up with the goddess Venus. And Venus is very jealous of this Earth woman, this mortal, called Psyche. Psyche is very beautiful, and she's always happy, and she's attracted legions of admirers, and Venus is wondering how this has happened. And she notices that Psyche has a pet unicorn called Unico. This one. And she realizes that if a mortal has a unicorn like that, they will be eternally happy. So she decides to trick Unico during a little kind of a pet contest, steals Unico, and hands him off to Zephyrus, which is this kind of wind deity or spirit. And she orders Zephyrus to bring Unico kind of to the end of the world, to the end times, etc, etc. Zephyrus, on the other hand, decides to show pity on Unico, and so brings Unico to these various times. However, before each kind of era begins for Unico, Unico has his memory reset. So that's kind of the basis storyline for this. In a way, you could call that a kind of a frame story, because what it essentially sets up to is that this story is episodic. Each story opens up with Unico being kind of put into this new world, this new situation. He engages with people, he might become friends with them, might start granting some wishes. Unico has magical powers, and if someone truly loves him, he's able to grant any wish that they have. So Unico becomes friends with them. He might get betrayed by them, he might still be friends with them, etc, etc. But eventually Zephyrus shows up again and has to take Unico away to this to another time, another era, at which point Unico's memories will be reset. So it is, in its purest essence, an episodic story. So a lot of the strength of this comes from, the strength of the individual stories. And the individual stories in general are pretty interesting. There's a lot of variety to them, going from, Native Americans and colonists to, Russia, to medieval kingdoms. There's a good variety in the eras that Tezuka pursues. And Tezuka tackles some pretty harsh themes throughout this, particularly considering that this is a kid's work. There's some very strong themes worked on, like, for example, interracial love, caste systems, kind of how animals are treated, etc, etc. There's some very strong themes dealt with here, which are very strong, very interesting. There are a couple of stories in this that didn't really do much for me. Like, for example, the longest story in this book, The Cat on the Broomstick, I thought was a bit long and kind of dragged a bit towards the end. But in general, I found the stories interesting, and I found them very kind of engaging. Definitely, I wouldn't say, in terms of stories and themes, I wouldn't put it amongst the best of Tezuka's work. But as a work for kids, I definitely think it's very strong and very engaging. In terms of continuing characters, really Unico and Zephyrus are the only ones that actually are present in each story. Zephyrus doesn't really get any character development whatsoever. She merely wants to protect Unico and move him from timeline to timeline, instead of bringing him to the end of the world, which is what Venus demanded of her. So Unico is really our main continuing character, and in that sense, Unico never gets any kind of proper character development, in the sense that he gets a total reset at the beginning of each story. So that doesn't allow him to develop as a character. So throughout the entire story, we see him constantly making these same mistakes, these same tragedies. But we also see him as a very trusting and loving character. Definitely, I think, a great kid's protagonist. Admittedly flawed, but in that sense it lends a bit more depth to him as a character. It is a shame that he can never truly develop, since he gets a total reset at the beginning of each story. I would have liked to see him develop as a character. In regards to the ending was a little bit of a disappointment for me, in the sense that the last story actually opens up with the characters, well, several characters, from the very first story, the frame story, per se. So I thought, at the beginning of the story, that we would actually see some kind of closure from that storyline. But it actually kind of ends up being another kind of side story, or another episodic story. So in that sense, it just seems strange to me that Tezuka would reintroduce these, you know, main characters from the frame story, only then to have it essentially be another episodic story. It's just a bit strange. I was expecting a bit more completion when those characters reintroduced, but they ended up not really doing much in the context of that last story. So I'm not sure. The ending was a little bit... I expected a bit more closure. But it wasn't a bad story either, so overall it wasn't bad, I should say, the last story. Just as an ending, I found it disappointing. Now, the thing that will grab most people's attention when they take a look at Unico is the fact that it's in full colour. If you take a look at this kind of artwork here, you can see that it's very lush looking, very pretty. It admittedly is very similar to Tezuka's earlier artwork, maybe a bit more detailed, but definitely his more cartoony looking earlier work, with some exceptions. So if that never did anything for you, unfortunately this might not work for you, but I'm a fan of his earlier art style, and I think that the coloration in this is very pretty, very lush. Admittedly, there are a couple of points I noticed where it seems slightly on the blurry side. I did hear that digital manga weren't able to use like the very original prints. They had to use some other form of print. And they had hoped to get the original print for the reprint of this. But unfortunately they weren't able to get their hands on it. So that's a shame, but that doesn't take away from the fact that this is a very pretty looking manga. The paneling is very nice as well, very distinct. As you can see, some very nice paneling here. But perhaps the thing that stands out to me the most in this manga is, you might notice it's the fact that Tezuka kind of goes out of the frames. You see at the edges here, that's kind of present throughout the entire manga, this kind of a frame, and Tezuka's constantly kind of letting the artwork flow out from that frame, which is very interesting. I'm not entirely sure why Tezuka chose to do that. Perhaps it was because he wanted to kind of let the artwork breathe. Very interesting choice. It definitely does give it a kind of a sense of an openness to it. Very distinct for me, and definitely something that I will be remembering this manga for. In terms of digital manga's treatment of this, there's a lot of things to cover here. For one, it is of a different trim size to the rest of their Tezuka Kickstarter titles. So if I grab a Captain Ken here, you will see that it is actually a little smaller than Captain Ken, which does look a bit annoying to me on the shelf, in that it doesn't kind of line up with the rest. It looks a bit out of place. Not entirely sure why digital manga chose to do that. Maybe it was just maybe the art looked better when it was down in this trim size. I'm not sure, but that was a little bit of a disappointment to me. However, the rest of it is very strong. The hardback, this is a hardback as you notice, and it's a very nice hardback, very high quality. The paper quality itself is very strong, very nice paper quality, which is exactly what you'd be looking for in a kind of a color manga anyway, so very nice. In terms of the rest of it though, there's no kind of extras to it, there's no kind of afterword from Tezuka himself or forward from someone else. At the best, you just have kind of this special thanks at the beginning for the backers, and that's it. So if you're looking for a little bit of extras, there's kind of nothing. But in a sense, the coloration itself is an extra. And then the other thing I should probably point out, this is probably something that you guys have already noticed. This is presented left to right, and there's probably a bunch of you who are saying, this is flopped, this is annoying, why would digital manga do that? Interesting fact, this was actually done for a magazine done by the company Sanrio, which is the company that do Hello Kitty. And as part of that, they wanted to kind of do like an international release. They wanted to do a lot of release a lot of these comics to Western audiences, and so they chose to actually present it in left to right. So when Tezuka did this, he actually did produce it left to right. So this is actually in the original format. I don't believe it was ever actually released in English internationally beyond the movies that adapted, I believe, a couple of stories from this, and one of them was original. But the manga itself was never released in English until Digital Manga actually released it. So in a sense, you could call that left to right construction of it a bit of a failure. I'm not exactly sure what ended up happening. Maybe these stories were too strong. Because that's the one other thing I want to point out about this. I've mentioned with Atom Cat that Atom Cat, I believe, is perfectly suitable for a child. They can read it by themselves and there'll be no problem. Triton, I believe, is a bit strong for children. I would recommend it for early teenagers, but I think for children it's a bit too strong. So what are my thoughts on Unico for children? And for my personal opinion is that I do believe it's suitable for children, but I do think some parental guidance might be necessary, particularly with such strong themes. That maybe a child might read it along with a parent, and if they have any questions about what's happening in the story, particularly to do with, discrimination or other themes, they might be able to ask their parents, and their parents can explain. I do think it works for children, but I do think that there should be some parental guidance when reading it. So overall, what do I think of Unico? I believe Unico is a good manga. It's obviously not up there with the best of Tezuka's work, but I didn't really believe that this was ever gonna be, considering it was aimed at children. It's a very pretty looking manga, very gorgeous, and there's some very nice themes covered in this. The lack of development on the part of Unico is a bit of a disappointment, but I understand why Tezuka chose to do that, to give it a true episodic sense. Overall, I think it's good. That's my kind of general opinion. Not great, not a masterpiece like so many of Tezuka's other works, but simply good. I do think it's a good read. And I definitely recommend it to Tezuka fans. To a general manga reader, it would depend on whether or not you like Tezuka's earlier artwork. Definitely, I think you'd be more likely to like this than his earlier artwork, simply because of how lush the coloration is. But I primarily recommend this to Tezuka fans themselves, and also to maybe parents looking for manga for their children. Although admittedly they will need to be there when their child is reading it. So that's my review of Unico. Hopefully you found it informative and entertaining. I definitely love to hear your thoughts on this. If you've read Unico yourself, what your thoughts were, what did you think of it? Do you think that a child could read this without supervision from their parents, etc, etc? I'd love to see those comments in below. So thanks for watching. Don't forget to comment, rate, subscribe, and bye-bye.